Zeno was introduced as something that immediately feels familiar, not because of anything explicitly stated at first, but because of the way he presents himself, the posture, the composure, the quiet confidence that suggests control rather than reaction. For anyone familiar with Resident Evil, that presence points in one direction almost instantly. It points to Albert Wesker. And that similarity is not subtle. It is deliberate. Zeno looks like him, moves like him, and carries himself with the same kind of authority that made Wesker stand out from everyone around him, as though he exists slightly above the situation rather than within it. At a glance, he appears to be a continuation of that idea, someone who has inherited not just the physical traits, but the identity that came with them. But the more you follow his story, the more that resemblance starts to shift from something convincing to something unstable. Because Zeno does not simply resemble Wesker, he is measured against him. And that comparison becomes unavoidable, especially as the cracks begin to show, as moments emerge where his control slips, where his decisions feel less calculated, where his understanding of the world around him does not quite match the certainty he projects. What makes that contrast more interesting is that Zeno never seems to question it. He operates as though the identity he presents is already complete, already proven, already beyond challenge. And that is where the problem begins. Because by the time his story reaches its end, by the time he stands in front of something he believes will elevate him even further, everything collapses in a way that reveals something much more fundamental than a simple defeat. Zeno does not just lose power, he loses the illusion that he ever truly had it. And that outcome is not the result of a single mistake, but of a misunderstanding that was present from the very beginning. A belief that looking like something, acting like something, and possessing its abilities is enough to become it, which in his case was never true. And that is what makes his character worth examining, not as a failed villain, but as something far more specific, an imitation that never realized it was one. That illusion becomes easier to understand when you look at where Zeno exists within the wider world of Resident Evil, because he is not introduced as someone struggling for relevance or trying to establish himself. He begins at the top. Zeno is a high-ranking member of The Connections, an international syndicate that operates almost entirely from the shadows, influencing global events, developing and distributing bioweapons, and inserting itself into systems of power without ever fully revealing its structure. Their reach extends into governments, corporations, and even the downfall of Umbrella itself, positioning them as something that does not simply react to the world, but shapes it from behind the scenes. And within that organization, Zeno is not a subordinate figure. He is someone with authority, someone trusted to oversee and fund one of its most significant operations, the attempt to unlock Elpis, a project believed to hold the potential to control human consciousness on a global scale. That position matters because it means Zeno does not have to build his influence. He inherits it. He operates within a system that already grants him power, already places him above others, already reinforces the idea that he is part of something greater. But there is a difference between being placed into power and creating it for yourself. Wesker's position was something he carved out, something he maintained through manipulation, through foresight, through a constant awareness of the systems he was navigating. Zeno, by contrast, exists within a structure that supports him from the outset. And that creates a subtle but important distinction, because when power is given rather than built, it does not require the same level of understanding to maintain. It can be used, it can be projected, but it does not necessarily become part of the person in the same way. That is why Zeno's authority feels slightly different. It is real, but it is also reinforced externally, held in place by the organization around him rather than by his own ability to control it. And that difference becomes more important the moment that structure is challenged, because it raises a question that sits beneath everything he does. If you remove the system that supports him, what is actually left?
That question becomes even more relevant when you look at Zeno's abilities, because on the surface, they appear to place him firmly within the same category as Wesker. He possesses enhanced strength, speed, reflexes, and regenerative capabilities, all of which are tied to a VSACT mutation triggered by a prototype virus, linking him directly to the same kind of experimental lineage that produced some of the most powerful figures in the series. In isolation, those traits are enough to establish him as a significant threat. He is faster, stronger, and more resilient than any normal human, capable of overwhelming opponents through sheer physical superiority. But there is a subtle inconsistency in how that power manifests. Zeno is strong, but not untouchable. He is fast, but not beyond reach. There are moments where Leon is able to injure him, even severing his hand, something that immediately places a limit on how far that power extends. And while that might seem like a simple gameplay or narrative decision, it reflects something deeper about the character itself. Zeno has the outcome of a process, but not the process itself. He has been given abilities that mirror Wesker's, but he has not gone through the same journey that shaped how those abilities were understood and used. Wesker's power was something he adapted to, something he refined, something he integrated into his identity over time. It was not just something he had, but something he became. Zeno's power, by contrast, feels more like an addition than a transformation. It is present, it is effective, but it lacks the same sense of cohesion, the same feeling that it is fully integrated into who he is. And that creates a gap that becomes more noticeable the longer you observe him. Because power without origin is still power, but it is also something that can be taken away without fundamentally changing the person it was attached to. Which raises the possibility that underneath it all, that power might be doing more to define him than he is doing to define it.
That idea leads directly into the question of identity, because Zeno does not just resemble Wesker physically or in terms of ability. He appears to be built around the idea of Wesker, shaped in a way that encourages comparison, as though his existence is meant to echo something that already came before him. This is where the concept of imitation becomes unavoidable. Zeno is not simply similar to Wesker. He is framed as a version of him, something that occupies the same space, carries the same presence, and reflects the same core traits, but without ever fully establishing itself as something independent. And that becomes a problem the moment that comparison is made explicit. When Gideon refers to him as nothing more than an imitation, it does not function as an insult in the traditional sense. It functions as a clarification. It strips away the assumption that Zeno is an equal or a successor, and replaces it with something much more limiting. An imitation is defined by what it copies. It does not exist on its own terms. And that creates a tension within Zeno's character, because everything about him suggests that he sees himself as something complete, something established, something that does not require validation. But that perception is built on a foundation that comes from somewhere else. He is not defining himself. He is reflecting something that has already been defined. And that reflection can only hold as long as it is not directly challenged, as long as no one forces the comparison to its logical conclusion. Because once that happens, Once the question is no longer whether he resembles Wesker, but whether he actually is him in any meaningful sense, the answer becomes much harder to maintain.
That tension becomes more visible through Zeno's involvement with Elpis, because this is where his actions move beyond presentation and into something that reveals how he actually thinks. As a leading figure within the connections, Zeno plays a central role in funding and supporting Victor Gideon's research. Specifically, the attempt to unlock Elpis, a project believed to be capable of controlling human consciousness. For an organization built around the creation and distribution of bioweapons, the idea of something that can control minds represents the ultimate form of power. It removes resistance, eliminates opposition, and transforms control into something absolute. Zeno embraces that idea completely. But what makes his involvement interesting is not just that he believes in Elpis, but why he believes in it. For him, Elpis is not just a tool, it is validation. It represents the next step, the confirmation that the kind of superiority he associates himself with is not only real, but expandable, something that can be extended beyond physical power into something more complete. And that belief aligns him closely with Gideon, even if their approaches differ. Both of them are working toward the same goal. Both of them are convinced they understand what Elpis represents, and both of them are building their actions around that conviction. But the key similarity is not the goal itself, it is the certainty behind it. Neither of them questions whether they are right. They only act on the assumption that they already are. And that shared certainty is what sets the stage for everything that follows, because it creates a situation where two individuals, both convinced of their understanding, are moving toward the same objective without ever fully engaging with the reality of what it actually is. Which means that when that reality finally reveals itself, it is not just their plan that collapses, it is the belief that held it together in the first place. That shared certainty between Zeno and Gideon is what makes their partnership work for as long as it does, but it is also what guarantees that it cannot last. Because while they appear to be aligned, both working toward the same goal, both convinced they understand what Elpis represents, they are actually approaching it from two slightly different misunderstandings that are never fully reconciled. Gideon believes he is continuing Spencer's vision, interpreting Elpis as the final step in a process of human evolution that he has convinced himself he understands. Zeno, on the other hand, sees Elpis as something more immediate, a tool that can be used to consolidate power, to elevate himself further, to reinforce the position he already occupies within the connections. At a glance, those motivations seem compatible, but the problem is that neither of them is grounded in reality. They are not working with Elpis as it is, they are working with what they believe it to be. And that creates a situation where both men are moving toward the same objective, but for reasons that are built on unstable foundations. This is where the parallel becomes important, because despite their differences in personality and approach, both Gideon and Zeno are defined by the same flaw. They believe they understand something they do not. For Gideon, that misunderstanding is about the nature of Elpis itself. For Zeno, it is about something more personal. It is about what it means to be powerful, what it means to be superior, and ultimately, what it means to be Wesker. And that distinction is what sets the stage for the moment where everything between them begins to collapse. That collapse does not happen through a physical confrontation, at least not at first. It happens through a shift in perception. At some point, Gideon stops treating Zeno as an equal and instead reframes him entirely, reducing him to something far more limited with a single line. "You are nothing but an imitation." What makes that moment so effective is not just the insult itself, but what it implies. It strips away everything Zeno relies on to define himself, his resemblance to Wesker, his power, his position, and reduces it to something derivative, something secondary, something that only exists because something else existed first. And that is a fundamentally destabilizing idea for a character like Zeno, because his identity is not built from the ground up, it is built from comparison. As long as that comparison works in his favor, as long as he can present himself as equal to or aligned with the original, the illusion holds. But the moment someone forces that comparison in the opposite direction, the entire structure becomes fragile. Zeno is no longer being seen as Wesker-like. He is being seen as less than Wesker. And that distinction is not something he can easily ignore, because it reframes everything he is. It turns his power into something borrowed, his identity into something incomplete, his presence into something performative rather than inherent. And once that idea is introduced, it cannot be undone. It sits beneath everything that follows, influencing the decisions he makes and the way he reacts to what comes next. Because from that point on, Zeno is no longer just acting as himself, he is reacting to the possibility that he is not what he thought he was. That reaction leads directly into the most important decision he makes. Faced with the promise of Elpis, and still operating under the belief that it represents the next step in human evolution, Zeno chooses to inject himself with it, expecting it to enhance him, to push him beyond his current limits, to bring him closer to the level he associates with true superiority. On the surface, this decision aligns perfectly with the kind of character he appears to be. It is decisive. It is ambitious. It reflects a willingness to act rather than hesitate. But underneath that, it reveals something much more significant. It shows that his understanding has not changed. Despite everything, despite the tension with Gideon, despite the implicit challenge to his identity, he is still operating on the same assumption, that he knows what Elpis is, that he understands what it will do, and that using it will confirm everything he already believes about himself. This is the moment where belief fully replaces understanding. Because the information is there, the uncertainty is present, the contradiction has already been introduced, and yet he moves forward anyway. Not because he has verified the outcome, but because he needs it to be true. He needs Elpis to be what he believes it is, because if it is not, then the foundation of everything he has built begins to fall apart. And that is why the decision matters, not just because of what it leads to, but because of what it reveals. Zeno is not acting on knowledge, he is acting on necessity. The necessity to maintain the identity he has constructed, even if doing so requires ignoring the possibility that it might be flawed.
The consequence of that decision is immediate, and more importantly, irreversible. Elpis does not enhance Zeno. It does not elevate him. Instead, it does the exact opposite of what he expects, neutralizing the viral enhancements that define his abilities and stripping away the power that has been supporting his identity from the very beginning. In that moment, everything changes, because the thing that allowed him to present himself as superior, the thing that reinforced the comparison to Wesker, the thing that gave weight to his confidence, is suddenly gone, and what remains is not a refined version of himself,
but something far more exposed. Without his abilities, Zeno is no longer operating above others. He is operating alongside them. And that shift reveals something that was always there, but never fully visible. There is nothing underneath the power to replace it. No deeper layer of identity. No alternative foundation to fall back on. No sense of self that exists independently of the abilities he was given. His confrontation with Leon reflects this change clearly. Where before there was dominance, now there is vulnerability. Where before there was control, now there is reaction. And that transition does not feel like a temporary setback. It feels like the removal of something essential. Something that was never truly integrated into who he was, but was instead holding that version of himself together from the outside. Which is why, once it is gone, the collapse is not gradual, it is immediate.
By the time Zeno reaches the end of his story, the outcome feels less like a defeat and more like a resolution to something that had been building from the very beginning. Because everything that defines him, his power, his position, his identity, is tied to something external, something that he has taken on rather than created for himself. And that makes him fundamentally different from the person he is trying to replicate. Wesker was not defined by what he had, he was defined by what he chose to become. Every decision he made reinforced that identity. Every action strengthened it, until there was no separation between the idea and the individual. Zeno never reaches that point. He begins with the appearance of that identity, the power, the presence, the authority, but without the process that made it real. And without that process, everything he builds on top of it remains dependent on the conditions that support it. The moment those conditions are removed, the identity collapses with them. That is why Zeno does not fail simply because he is weaker or less capable or outmatched in a direct sense. He fails because there is nothing sustaining him beyond the surface level, no internal structure, no independent sense of self, only a reflection of something that already existed. And that is what ultimately defines him. Not as a successor, not as an equal, but as something that was never meant to stand on its own in the first place. Because imitation can replicate form. It can replicate behavior. It can even replicate power to a certain extent. But it cannot replicate origin. It cannot replicate the process of becoming something. And without that, no matter how close it gets, it will always remain what it started as. Not Wesker, just something that tried to be him.